There are a lot of people listening to us right now who know who you are and who are somewhat familiar with your writings, and there are probably a lot more who don't know who you are and who aren't familiar with your writings. So I wondered if, other than the capsule biography that's always given of you, professor of linguistics at MIT and longtime writer on political subjects, if I could go for a few brief instants into your past, especially as regards the subject matter we're talking about today. When and how did you first get interested in matters of Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East?
Oh, when I was about 4 years old, I guess. I grew up in a home in which the major questions were Jewish life in the diaspora, the relations to what was then Palestine, questions of Zionism. My earliest political activism, and in fact virtually my whole life was, as a teenager, was around these questions. I went to live in a kibbutz for a while back in the early 50s. Came very close to staying there, in fact.
What was that experience like? Can you recreate the early years a little bit for our listeners, what it was like to live in Israel on a kibbutz as a young person in the young years of the State of Israel?
Yeah, no, I didn't live there for a long time. I lived there for a couple of months in 1953. My wife then went back, and for a longer period, we intended to stay. At that time, it was sort of a third world country. There were pockets of wealth, but it was quite poor. The kibbutz where we lived was extremely poor. This particular kibbutz happened to be kind of Buberite, sort of left wing of the kibbutz movement, and German emigres from about 20 years earlier, influenced by Buber. It was part of the movement part of the kibbutz movement that had grown out of a binationalist, anti-statist background. Now, of course, this was after the state had been established, so that had been changed, but there was still a sort of a gesture towards earlier notions of Arab-Jewish cooperation in a socialist culture. And those things at that time were still alive, so there were people who would, for example, go to the guard posts without rifles because they thought it was improper to shoot at the infiltrators, who were basically people from right there who had been driven out of their lands as they knew. In the kibbutz itself, it was in a transition from a deeply committed socialist cooperative background to integrating into the state apparatus, and it was already clear that that was going to lead to substantial changes.
You said something there which I don't want to let pass by quickly, that you had guard posts on this kibbutz and that there were people you were guarding against, and that in fact you had some kind of consciousness, at least you did, if not the collective kibbutz did, that this land had previously been claimed by someone else.
Oh, that was everybody's consciousness in those days. That's why it wasn't, there were kibbutz members who would serve their guard duty unarmed because they knew that the people in those days you didn't call the people coming across terrorists, you called them infiltrators. And a lot of the infiltrators were people who had lived right there and who had been driven out in 1948. In fact, right near this kibbutz, just like a kilometer away, I guess, there was the rubble of a village that I asked about it when I was out in the fields once, and they told me kind of shamefacedly that it was a village that they had destroyed in 1948 just out of fear that the people who lived there might take part in in the war, although so far everything had been peaceful. And that village was destroyed and the people fled.
Was there any effort at that time to reach across the line of those who were Israeli settlers on this land and those who had previously lived there? Was there really any chance that you see, looking at it with historical hindsight, that there could have been, as you mentioned in a phrase I believe a few minutes ago, some sort of Israeli-Arab socialist approach to the State of Israel?
Well, I think there were. It's very hard to put a probability on it, a number, but I think there was a significant possibility in the pre-state period that some kind of cooperative, some sort of federation-type arrangement could have been established throughout what was then mandatory Palestine. there were, for one thing, very real, and the socialist institutions of the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement, were very real. In fact, they were dominant. There were a lot of, splits and cross currents, but a substantial part of the kibbutz movement was in favor of one or another form of Arab-Jewish working-class cooperation, and parts of it were, in fact, opposed to the idea of a Jewish state, recognizing that would probably terminate those efforts. I guess in the pre-Holocaust period, it was quite a real possibility in the 1930s. By the early 40s, as the immensity of the Holocaust began to sink in, these questions sort of dropped into the background, though they remained alive. I mean, I guess about 20% of the Histadrut, the huge labor union, about 20% of it was still opposed to a Jewish state after the Second World War. Well, see, after the state was established, a new question arose. The question really was, is the state going to be a Jewish state or is it going to be a democratic state? Now, with all the fudging that one can do, the two concepts really are not consistent. And the more honest people recognize that from the beginning. If it's a democratic state, that means if it's a state on the Western model, on the theoretical, let's put aside the reality of life in the Western democracies and talk about the theory. In theory, in, say, France or in the United States, if you're a citizen, you have the same rights as any other citizen. On the other hand, if, say, the United States were a Christian state with special, or a white state with special privileges to one sector, let's say the majority sector of the population, then it would not be a state in which citizens have equal rights. I mean,
of course, one would argue, there are many people who would argue that you are describing the way the United States is right now.
Well, that's why I started by saying let's look at the theory rather than the practice.
Okay.
There's no doubt that in practice it's a racist state in many ways, but there's a commitment to overcome the racist elements. There's at least a theoretical commitment, and in the minds of plenty of people, a real commitment to overcome the racist features of the state. On the other hand, if those are built into the very sinews of the state, the very structure of the state, if they're at the core of its existence, and there's no commitment at all to overcome them, in fact, they're regarded as the essence of the state, then that's quite a different situation. Now, there's a difference between sort of practicing discrimination, practicing racism, and institutional, the kind of racism and discrimination that's built into the core of the institutional structure of the state. Those are real differences. And in fact, there's a residue in the Western democratic societies. There's a residue of legalized, institutionalized discrimination, and people of, say, moderately progressive people. I'm not talking about the far left, but ordinary liberals will try to overcome this. Now, in the case of Israel, that dilemma arose very clearly in 1948, and it was never faced straight on. But it's at the heart of the problem that you're raising. The question is, what happens to the sector of the population that's not Jewish? Now, the way Israel this has been dealt with, and already at the time that I lived there, you could see that it was being dealt with in a deceptive and dishonest manner, which was going to cause long-term problems. We're now not talking about the occupied territories. This is pre-1967. But even for Israel inside the Green Line, the internationally recognized borders, pre-67 borders, this problem does arise, and in the 1950s it was a serious problem. Notice that there was also, quite independently of this, a problem of discrimination of the Western type. That was a problem that arose with regard to the Western-born and the Jews of Western origin and the Jews of Arab origin. The so-called Oriental Jews were subjected to harsh and unpleasant discrimination. Now, that's racism of the Western type. That is, theoretically, they had all the rights of citizenship. But in human relations and in administrative practice and so on, they were very definitely second class. On the other hand, the relation of the Arabs was quite different. They didn't even have the rights of citizenship, and that remains the case, incidentally. And that raises a different kind of problem. I think it makes sense to distinguish those two problems. The problem of discrimination and the problem of institutionalized distinctions that define the nature of the state.
Well, let's throw in another problem and complicate the mix to the point where it's been at ever since this nation-state was founded, the question of religious practices, too. The divisions among the Jewish people themselves and the opposition divisions within the Muslim faith and the small amount of Christians who also consider that territory to be the Holy Land. How do you see that as having played itself out in the tortuous situation we now have in Israel today?
Well, now we're turning to the present rather than the early 50s. In the present, that's a very serious problem. I mean, the Jewish, again, inside the Green Line, inside Israel proper, the dominant community, the Jewish community, is torn right down the middle on the issue of secularism. There's basically two Israels. Now, just speaking about the Jewish population, there's two Israels. There is a sort of a secular, westernized sector of the population, and there's a semi-feudal Orthodox part of the population with completely different values and commitments and so on. They're at each. The tension between the two of those sectors is very significant. Something similar is happening in the Arab community in connection with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism.
You say this is something that's current, but those tendencies in the Jewish faith, of course, have been present for centuries before this founding of the State of Israel. Why do you think it's come to so much of a crux more recently rather than in the early 50s that we started talking about?
In the early 50s, the society was basically secular. The Orthodox religious elements had nothing remotely like the influence that they have today. They were there. I mean, there was a national religious party. The militant, messianic, fundamentalist element was much more marginal, and the society was basically secular, and in fact, social democratic.
How many times have you revisited the State of Israel and Palestine since your first visit there to live on a kibbutz in the 50s?
I visited again in the early mid-60s, and I visited the third time was just last year, but not for long stays, either of those other two times.
But in between times, I think it's fair to say that you've been a close student of the issues and have read...
I've kept very close to it. I have many close friends. I read Hebrew, so I have friends who send me huge quantities of Hebrew clippings from the current press, and I keep up with literature and so on. So yeah, I've followed it pretty closely, and it's always been, as I say, I kind of when I grew up, this was my whole milieu, environment. Everything else was secondary to it.
Do you read Arabic?
I did read Arabic at one time. In fact, I studied, when I went to college, my intention as a teenager was to, we all have our illusions, and mine was that I was going to go live in the Middle East and work for Jewish-Arab cooperation. I knew Hebrew well, and I wanted to learn Arabic, and I studied Arabic, and intended, in fact, to pursue that course. I was, as I mentioned before, that I was a Zionist activist, but I was an activist in the section of the Zionist movement that was opposed to a Jewish state. At that time, that was considered mainstream Zionism, opposition to a Jewish state. And Arab-Jewish cooperation was a strong element of the kind of commitment that I had to Zionism. So yeah, I studied Arabic at the time. I lost it since. I haven't followed it up.
We're talking with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at MIT, frequent writer of books, articles, speaker on the question of the Middle East, the State of Israel, the condition of the Palestinians, and we're going to get up in a few minutes to the current situation there. But first, I'd like to try to get a little more historical background of your thinking about how things changed. When you visited in the 1960s, was this the era of Golda Meir, approximately?
Yeah, I was there in 1960, I guess it was 1964. And it was very much the way it had been when I'd been there a decade earlier. It was still the political structure of the state was basically Labor Party. The kibbutz movement, the socialist institutions were still pretty strong. The dominant culture was still secular. Incidentally, the dominant culture was, in a sense, anti-Zionist. So the term Zionism was used as a term of ridicule, virtually, among moderately educated people.
What did they understand Zionism to be that they were against?
Something that the Americans do, they were just living there. In fact, there's still a tinge of that in the Hebrew language and the Hebrew usage. But then it was pretty much alive, and there was no sort of overwhelming chauvinism and so on. There was a kind of there were plenty of problems, but it was from my point of view, from the point of view of my attitudes and interests, it was an attractive place in a lot of ways. Many things changed in 1967.
To what extent was the pre-1967 state of Israel dependent on the economic contributions of private citizens in the United States and of the United States government, and how did that change after 1967?
Well, it always was enormous. In fact, virtually the entire investment in Israel is externally generated. So there's very little internally generated investment. That was also true prior to 1967. Of course, the level of foreign funding increased very sharply after 67, as did economic growth and military growth. But the fact of the matter is that the dependence on external sources was always enormous, to the extent that, as I say, it was virtually the entire investment is externally generated, and that was true then as well.
What can the
That's why, incidentally, Israel's not a very meaningful model for third world countries. I mentioned before that back around 1950, it had a lot of third world features to it, and even in the early 60s, that remained to some extent true. But now, of course, it's a modern Western society from an economic point of view. But that's not a model for other third world societies because they don't have anything remotely comparable to this external source of funding.
Well, they may have if the United States continues to take over countries like Panama and Nicaragua in the near future.
An entirely different relationship.
You have written extensively, as I said, about the state of Israel, and to try to bring things up here to something like the current day, you've quoted various writers. I'm quoting now from your book, The Culture of Terrorism, saying that Israel is really now just another federal agency of the United States, one that's convenient to use when you want something done quietly. Another quotation from an Israeli newspaper saying Israel is the Godfather's messenger undertaking the dirty work for the Godfather, who is, of course, in this case, the United States, the Godfather always trying to appear to be the owner of some large, respectable business. How did we get to that point from the relatively idealistic state that you're talking about here in the early years and even into the 60s?
Yeah. I don't want to exaggerate the idealistic and utopian character of it. It was not that, but there was a very substantial change. I think that's quite real. And the change was in 1967. It's easy to date. In 1967, as Israel took over the territories, after this huge military victory, its status, its relations to the United States, its internal problems changed quite dramatically. And one of the changes took place is the one that you've just described, the relation of dependency on the United States. Up until 1967, there was a situation of tension and conflict, but it was relatively low level. Since 1967, the relationship of Israel to its neighbors has been one of always threatening major war. That is, as long as Israel holds on to the occupied territories, and remember at that time that also included the Sinai, on the verge of major war with its neighbors. And that means that it was completely dependent on external support for its survival, and that external support was the United States, because the United States was alone in essentially backing the maintaining Israeli control over the territories. Now, Israel had some choices at that time. One choice was to move towards a peaceful political settlement with its neighbors, which would have meant relinquishing the territories in the context of a general peace agreement. The other course that it could have taken was to, and in fact did take, was to maintain control over the territories, which meant a permanent state of war and reliance on the United States and entering into a client relationship, which degenerated, as expected, as predicted, to a mercenary relationship with the United States. Those were two options that were open in the period after 1967. Now, the fact of the matter is they picked the second. And I don't think that was forced. I think there were opportunities to go a different way. The different way would have been towards political settlement. I think there really were opportunities. There have been since shortly after the 1967 war, and they were opposed by the political leadership in Israel, and the United States backed them in that opposition.
Which political
leadership? And that
leadership
leads us to the present situation.
Right. Which political leadership in Israel are you talking about at that stage? Who were the ones who were responsible?
Well, at that time it was the Labor Party. The Labor Party remained the political leadership. There was a national unity government, but it was basically Labor Party controlled, and that remained true until 1977. And contrary to a lot of mythology, the Labor Party government, the EQed government, and later the Meir government, blocked options towards a peaceful political settlement. Not only did not pursue them, but in fact blocked them.
Why did they do this?
Well, there was a feeling of great euphoria after the 1967 victory. There was a feeling that Israel had proven that it's an extremely powerful country. People were talking about how it's one of the most powerful countries in the world. Not only there was a rise in religious fanaticism, God is on our side, as was proven by the victory. Big military victories have a very bad effect on a society. That's very common. In fact, maybe almost universal. And it was true then. There were vast illusions. It engendered a tremendous amount of racism toward the Arabs. So, for example, people like say the chief of military intelligence, Yehoshafat Harkabi, is a well-known Arabist, and also then chief of military intelligence, now incidentally a leading dove. But back at that time, he was making statements about how war is not the Arabs' game. We don't have to worry about the Arabs. They don't understand things like war. That's our game. Generals were talking about how Israel could conquer everything from Baghdad to Morocco to Khartoum within a week if they wanted to. But, maybe we don't have to bother. This sense of kind of racist arrogance and euphoria led to a near disaster in 1973. They simply didn't take seriously the military operations, which looked as though they were planning for a move into the occupied territories, and Israel simply didn't take it seriously. They were kind of laughing at these Arabs who don't know which end of the gun to hold, and so on. And that cost them very dearly.
Right. In the 1960s, if we can just backtrack a little bit, the United States overt and covert military intelligence establishment was, of course, preoccupied mainly in Southeast Asia. Was there, at the same time, a major effort made to maintain influence and cooperate with the government of Israel in the Middle East by the Johnson administration and the early Nixon administration?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, to go back a little bit, during the 1950s, the United States had not quite settled on which side it was going to line up in the Middle East. So for a time, the United States was pro-Nasser. But then when Nasser made it clear that he was an independent nationalist, the United States turned against him. It's always opposed to independent nationalism. By 1958, the National Security Council was already considering, you look back at memoranda that have been declassified, they recognized that Israel could be a reliable ally, kind of a local base for supporting U.S. Power in the region, opposed to what was called radical Arab nationalism, independent nationalism. By the 1960s, Israel was beginning to be used as a way for the United States to penetrate black Africa. There was a substantial CIA program supporting Israeli penetration of black African countries as a kind of front for the United States to extend U.S. influence and for intelligence gathering and so on. After the '67 war, these relationships changed dramatically. The United States was extremely impressed with Israel's military victory. That made Israel a real darling in the United States, across the spectrum, I should say. American liberals, for example, fell madly in love with Israel after 1967, largely because of the way that they had demonstrated their capacity to use force effectively against a third world country. That has all sorts of things to do with internal developments in the United States at the time. But that's when Israel really became, the darling of American liberalism, and very much loved by those who wield power, because they recognized that Israel knew how to use the mailed fist. And furthermore, in the condition of conflict that now existed, it would be dependent on the United States and therefore dependable. As long as Israel and the United States could prevent, as they have been doing, a political resolution, the United States had a valued mercenary state. And at that point, this was the time of the Nixon Doctrine, recall, a few years later, which recognized that the United States did not have the power to police the whole world itself with the changing situation, and it therefore needed regional forces that would control particular regions with the cops on the beat, as the Defense Secretary Melvin Laird put it. The United States needed cops on the beat with police headquarters in Washington. And in the Middle East, which is a region of enormous economic and strategic importance because of the oil, in the Middle East, the cops on the beat were to be Israel and Iran under the Shah. In fact, a kind of tripartite alliance developed between Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia in the about that time, around 1970, with Israel being kind of a local enforcer. Furthermore, increasingly, the United States began to turn to Israel to carry out operations elsewhere in the world where it needed counterinsurgency specialists or arms sales or other forms of penetration and intervention. Latin America was a major case,
and of course,
also Asia.
If you look at the updating of that and take it into the 1980s, as we've tried to do on Pacifica, somewhat in vain against the mass torrent of propaganda that would not look at these questions, you see in the triangular relationship you were talking about there, or even the four-part relationship between Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Latin America, many of the roots of what eventually became the so-called Iran-Contra affair.
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact,
which did not spring up wholeheartedly out of Oliver North's head in 1985.
In fact, to get up to that, I mean, in my view, I've written about this, but I was writing about this in the early 1980s. It was already very clear that the United States was sending arms to Iran via Israel. That was very well documented in the early 1980s. I myself wrote about it in 1983. And the purpose was made very clear by Israel, by Israeli commentators publicly, high-level Israeli commentators, including people in the Mossad and so on. They said exactly that the purpose was to find elements within the Iranian military who would be able to overthrow the Khomeini regime and restore the relationship that existed with the Shah.
So-called moderates.
Yeah, moderates, they're called. Right, exactly. And in fact, one of the leading Israeli arms dealers, I think it was Yaakov Nimrodi, or one of them, I've forgotten who, said that what we have to do is find a general who's willing to slaughter 10,000 people in the streets. And if we can find that man, then we can achieve what we want. And that's why the United States was using Israel to provide arms to elements in the Iranian military in the early 80s. Recall that this is long before there were any hostages. It had nothing to do with any hostages.
Well, it had something to do with the hostages who had been released upon the election of Ronald Reagan.
Maybe, but you see, I rather doubt. I mean, quite apart from what the truth may be about the Reagan-Bush-Khomeini deal, it may be what it is. Let's say it's what many people have speculated. It still doesn't explain why the United States sent arms to Iran after the hostages were released. Mm-hmm. Why did the United States send the arms to Iran? I mean, the hostages had been released. This was the embassy hostages. after they'd been released, you still have to have an explanation as to why the arms were sent.
How about commerce as an explanation?
Pardon?
How about commerce as an explanation?
Commerce? No, the United States had very limited commercial relations with Iran. What we wanted to do was overthrow the government. There's a standard procedure when you want to overthrow a government, namely try to establish contacts in the military, because the military are the ones who are going to overthrow the government. And the way you establish contacts in the military is by sending arms, by training, by those kinds of connections. This is absolutely standard. The Iranian case was right, the normal pattern. That's the pattern of the Allende government in Chile, for example. The United States was trying to overthrow the Allende government, but at the same time it was supporting the Chilean military. And it maintained its contacts with the Chilean military because that's where a coup was going to come from. Or to take a case that just hit the front pages yesterday, I don't know if it did in California, but at least here, take the case of Indonesia.
Actually, it hit the front pages here last Sunday. It was broken by a Hearst newspaper of all places, and it was a front page story in the San Francisco Examiner. Yeah.
Okay, well, now that's an interest. I mean, there's actually nothing really new in that story, but it was kind of interesting to see some of the quotes. But if you go back to that, now during the early '60s, the United States was very hostile to the government of Indonesia, the Sukarno government. But at the same time, the United States continued to send arms to the Indonesian military. The whole time that we were in a situation of increasing conflict with Indonesia, we continued to send arms to the Indonesian military, and the purpose was to be able to either organize or back them when they carried out a military coup to establish a regime that we would favorable to U.S. interests, which they did in 1965, leading to this mass slaughter that was applauded in the United States and in fact still is.
Noam Chomsky, if I can, we only have 7 minutes left here approximately, and I have two important topics I'd like to get you to speak to KPFA listeners on in the time remaining to us. The first is a topic that you've written on so extensively, I'm almost ashamed to ask you to comment on it briefly, and especially in the book you recently co-authored with Edward Herman, Manufacturing Consent. And that is, if you can give us a capsule definition of how it is that the situation that you've begun to outline here in Israel and the Middle East has been so distorted and hidden from the American people that there really is absolutely no consciousness whatsoever of what is going on over there, what the state of Israel is and does, and how it came to be. How have we had that blindfold so securely fastened around our culture?
Well, it's a long story, and I hate to be glib about it, but just the main outlines. Since 1967, there's been a real love affair with Israel, mainly because of Israel's demonstration of its capacity to use force against third world opponents, which wins a lot of prizes in the United States. As a consequence of that, the U.S. government has had intimate relationships with Israel. Israel has become a kind of a mercenary state serving U.S. interests. And the media and the intellectual community never stray very far from state policy. And in this case, they had their own reasons for supporting Israeli power and suppressing a good deal of the reality of what was going on there. And in fact, that has enormously colored reporting and interpretation. So I have mentioned a few times in our discussion here that the United States and Israel have been blocking opportunities for a peaceful political settlement certainly since about 1970, 71. That's virtually unknown here. The basic documentary record is not reported. It's you often have to. You can't even find it in the scholarly literature much of the time. It's out of the media. It's out of public consciousness, and that continues to be the case up until today. I mean, let's take right now. Right now, almost the entire world for years, including the Arab states and the PLO, has been pressing for a two-state settlement, a general peace treaty for the entire region, with guarantees of the security of every state in the region and so on, and a Palestinian state established in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That's been a very broad international consensus since certainly the mid-1970s, and it remains true today. The United States has blocked it. Israel's been opposed. Both political parties have been opposed to it, and the United States has blocked it and continues to block it. Right now, what's called the peace process in the United States, that refers to the Baker Plan. The Baker Plan is a support for what's called the Shamir Plan. Actually, it's the Shamir-Peres Plan. The very terms of that plan have never even been published in the United States, except in marginal journals like, say, Z Magazine, where I've published them. The terms of that plan are completely rejectionist. The only game in town, from the point of view of the U.S. press, bars the possibility of a Palestinian state. The basic premises of the Baker-Shamir-Peres plan are that there already is a Palestinian state, namely Jordan, and that there can be no second Palestinian state, and that the purpose of any negotiations will be simply to settle a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. That rules out any rights for the Palestinians. Well, the United States and Israel are virtually alone in the world in insisting upon this position and blocking possible diplomatic options that have always existed and continue to exist towards a general peace settlement. And that is virtually totally suppressed in the U.S. media. There's almost nothing about it.
There's another aspect of it which I found equally absurd, which is the charade that's currently being played out in such U.S. media as covered as the New York Times, that major ruling political forces in Israel are rejecting the Baker Plan, as if there was a split between these two forces, whereas logic would seem to say that any nation that survives almost entirely on the largesse of another nation is capable of having its political will bent by that nation, and if Baker and Bush wanted something in Israel, they'd get it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in fact, there's a consensus in the U.S. political leadership to establish the modalities of this plan. As in any country, much of the population doesn't agree with the state policy, just as it's true here. But there is no organized political force in Israel calling for a political settlement, and there won't be until such forces get support from the United States. You hit the nail on the head when you talked about the relations of dependency. I mean, Israel has chosen a course, very unwisely in my view, but it's chosen a course which makes it extremely dependent on the United States. And that means that no political force can develop in Israel unless it has backing in the United States. Until there is powerful support in the United States for a general political settlement, which means recognition of Palestinian national rights alongside of Israel, until there's support for that in the United States, articulate, organized support, such forces are not going to reach any degree of strength inside Israel either. They need the support from here in order to survive.
One final question, Noam Chomsky, if I could get you to briefly comment on something that you've written about at article length and book length as well, and that is the Intifada, and especially the knowledge of the Intifada here in the United States. We see over and over again, with very rare exceptions, although there are some, including in the New York Times, which we all like to beat up on so much, which occasionally, like yesterday, writes an article that does have some truthful depiction of the situation of the Palestinian people and what they're undergoing. But by and large, the portrait we get of what the Palestinians are doing is of out-of-control, rioting teenagers and Israeli military who are applying the most benign possible pressure to suppress this uprising. Do you see that having to go to full-scale civil war before any kind of truthful understanding is reached here in the United States?
The coverage of the occupation has been extremely, misleading is an understatement. It's been extremely distorted since the beginning. It was always a harsh and brutal military repression. Occupation. There is no other kind of military occupation. Since the Intifada got started, it's become a lot worse. I mean, sometimes when it reaches kind of outlandish brutality at American media, but what is not reported or understood, there is a highly totalitarian regime controlling every aspect of the life of a Palestinian at every moment and in a completely arbitrary and irrational fashion. That's part of its purpose. There's constant humiliation, harsh repression. People have to be taught not to raise their heads. That's actually the way they put it. And they're taught that in every possible way, whether it's breaking the bones of children or forcing people to get authorization to carry out the most minor act. The killings at the just a couple of days ago, recall where they were. They were at a place which is called in Israel the slave market. That's the place where Palestinian workers come in the hope that maybe they can get some miserably low-paying job where they'll be treated like worse than pigs in the hope that they can survive. Now, the fact that it's called the slave market tells you exactly what you need to know about the ongoing situation, which does not get reported here. Israel has not permitted independent economic development in the territories. If you want to, say, carry out some, build a little factory or workshop or something, you have to get, not only do you have to get permission, but you have to get affidavits showing from Israeli producers saying this won't interfere with our trade, won't compete with us. In every imaginable way, there is constant humiliation, repression, brutality, and total control exercised over the population. They're going to revolt. I mean, and that whether Israel can repress them by force, I don't know. Nobody can know how long, how much flesh and blood can endure. But it's going to be an ugly, shameful situation as long as the occupation persists.
You have been listening to Dr. Noam Chomsky in an interview with Larry Bensky of Pacifica station KPFA in Berkeley, California. He is a professor of linguistics and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and author of many books and articles on contemporary affairs. He writes regularly for Zeta Magazine and Lies of Our Times. For a copy of this program, call the Pacifica Program Service at 800-735-0230. That's 800-735-0230.